Alors, suite à la présentation, on va passer maintenant à la période de table ronde et les questions du public, c'est-à-dire vous. First, I will introduce the roundtable participants who will be here to answer your questions. First person is Lorne Trottier. Lorne Trottier is a member of the board of the TEFP and president of the Trottier Family Foundation. He co-founded Matrox, a company known for its innovative computer graphics products and a world leader in the field of computer graphics, video, and imaging. In 2003, he received the prestigious Prix Lionel Boulet, Quebec's highest honor for innovation and leadership in applied technology and its contribution to Quebec's economic growth. Lorne earned bachelor's and master's degrees in electrical engineering from McGill University, also receiving the British Association Gold Medal for outstanding academic achievement. He holds honorary doctorates from McGill, Université de Montréal, and the University of Ontario Institute of Technology. He's a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Engineering and a member of the Order of Canada. Second panel member is Peter Robinson. Peter Robinson is also a member of the board of the Trottier Futures Project and is CEO of the David Suzuki Foundation. He began his career as a park ranger in wilderness areas throughout BC, and I learned that he was decorated for bravery by the Governor-General of Canada. After his park career, he worked at BC Housing, eventually becoming its CEO. And prior to the current position, he served as CEO of Mountain Equipment Co-op. His humanitarian activities include working with the International Red Cross, as well as leading a team that monitored detained asylum seekers in BC. He currently serves as a director on the board of Imagine Canada, an organization that supports charities across the country. Peter holds a Master of Arts in Conflict Analysis and Management, a Bachelor of Arts in Geography, as well as diplomas in Community Economic Development and Fish and Wildlife Management. He completed a doctorate in Social Sciences in 2014. Pierre Lortie. Pierre Lortie is member of the board of the TFP and president of the Canadian Academy of Engineering. He's a senior business advisor at Denton's LLP, executive chairman of Quest Rare Minerals, director of Group Canam, and of Element Financial Corporation. He is a former president and COO of Bombardier Capital, Bombardier Aerospace Regional Aircraft, Bombardier International, and Bombardier Transportation. He's also a former chairman, president, and CEO of Provigo, president and CEO of the Montreal Stock Exchange, and senior partner of Secor. Pierre received an MBA with honors from the University of Chicago, a license in applied economics from Université Louvain in Belgium, and a bachelor's degree in engineering physics from Université Laval. He was awarded a doctorate honoris causa in civil law from Bishop's University. He's a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Engineering and a member of the Order of Canada. Oskar Sigvaldason. Oskar Sigvaldason is owner and president of SCMS Global, and he is project manager for the TFP. He's a director of the Energy Council of Canada and a member of the Global Energy Scenario Committee of the World Energy Council. He worked for 28 years with Acres International, an engineering consulting firm in the energy and infrastructure sectors, progressing to president and CEO of the Acres Group. Oskar earned a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from the University of Manitoba, a DIC from Imperial College London in concrete structures and technology, and a PhD in civil engineering from the University of London. He also studied management science, economics, environmental sciences, and water resources at Harvard University. He is a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Engineering, of the Canadian Society of Civil Engineering, and of the International Water Resources Association. He's an honorary life member of the Energy Council of Canada. Kathleen Vaillancourt. Kathleen Vaillancourt is president of ESMIA Consultants and core member of the Trottier Futures Project. She's been an energy modeling consultant and researcher for the past 15 years. She's involved in the Energy Technology Systems Analysis Program of the International Energy Agency, where she provides in-person training and technical support on how to develop Markle-Times energy models for strategic decision-making. These are the types of models that were referred to as linear programming optimization models in the presentation. She participated in the development of 9 national and global Markle-Times models for organizations in Canada and internationally. She has a successful track record of over 30 energy and environmental projects with an expertise in the analysis of ambitious GHG emission reduction strategies. Kathleen holds a PhD in environmental sciences from UQAM and an MBA from HEC Montréal. She also completed postdoctoral work at McGill on the long-term role and potential of GHG emission abatement. John Leggat. John Leggat is our 6th participant in the roundtable, and I invite him to join us at the front. And before we start the roundtable, I do want to mention that we had quite a large team. There were more people than the ones you see at front. And I want to, in particular, point out 3 people who are here with us today that also participated as part of the project team. Warren Mabey from Queen's University, Mara Carey from the David Suzuki Foundation, and André Plourde from over there, from Carleton University, who was a member of the expert panel, along with myself and with Ken Ogilvie, who unfortunately is not with us tonight. So this is to give you a view of the people who are here to answer your questions. We can tell you a lot about the study, but we want to really reach out to you and answer your questions. Alors, c'est le temps pour vous de poser vos questions. Je vais demander à nos panélistes de s'asseoir, de s'installer. Nous avons 2 micros dans la salle, alors si vous voulez poser des questions, je vous invite à aller à un des 2 micros, puis on procédera à tour de rôle. Georges-Émile.
J'ai un petit problème avec la notion de capture et de stockage du CO2. Un petit problème qui se résume simplement, pour combien de temps voulez-vous le garder en stockage? Parce que, contrairement à toutes sortes d'autres choses, le CO2, ça a une vie infinie. Si on veut le recombiner avec autre chose, il va falloir fournir plus d'énergie qu'on en a obtenu en le fabriquant. Ça prend beaucoup plus d'énergie pour extraire une tonne de CO2 de l'atmosphère que l'énergie que ça nous a donné en produisant une tonne de CO2. Et en plus, si on le capture et qu'on le renferme à quelque part, c'est une bombe à retardement. Parce que tôt ou tard, il va arriver ça prend 10 ans, 100 ans, 1000 ans, mais le CO2, il faut le garder pour toujours. Alors, si quelqu'un a un plan qui me dit qu'ils peuvent le garder pour toujours, je vais les laisser faire. Et s'ils ne peuvent pas le garder pour toujours, je pense qu'il faut éviter de commencer sur cette pente. Ça donne une bonne conscience aux gens qui produisent du CO2 en disant « on peut l'enlever ensuite ».
Est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un sur le panel qui veut prendre la question? Someone wants to take the question? I can roughly translate it in English as carbon capture and storage. It sounds like a non-so-permanent solution because you may be creating more problems for the future than are actually solving. And is it really a solution to produce CO2 and capture it rather than avoiding it in the first place? I think that's a fair summary of the question. Oskar?
So I'll just start on that. There's no question that carbon capture and storage is a very complex challenge, and the track record to date has not been particularly encouraging. But nevertheless, when we start to look at the options for actually making some progress on net negative emissions, we have to look at that more seriously. Most of the work that has been done has been focused on combining carbon capture and storage with coal-fired generation. However, we know now that in the US, there's a stronger focus on combining CCS with natural gas generation, where you get greater overall efficiency. And then in our project, we also looked at the opportunity of combining CCS with generation from biomass. And even though that's very expensive, it turned out to be actually a favorable option simply because of the strong economic drivers to find ways of actually extracting, in a net sense, CO2 from the atmosphere. So it is expensive, it has complexities, but it needs to be looked at, and it probably needs to be looked at in a somewhat different context than what has happened to date. So I'm sure there are other members of the panel.
Well, I think you have to look at, is this one on? I guess it is. You have to look at carbon capture and storage as being more than just the technical systems of extracting and then placing it in some capacity. For example, in the study is also improved forestry and agriculture and land use management. The best carbon and capture and storage is actually natural systems. So when we look at this entire study, we were trying to look at a different form of carbon capture and storage. And that's why you see everything from enhanced wood products through to better forest stewardship and agricultural practices. So there is some possibility on carbon capture and storage outside of the technical process.
If we can have another question.
I welcome the focus on the electrification of transport and transit. Why should we start with PMVs rather than the hard one, which is called the electrification of rail and transport, as they've done in Europe, as they have done in Asia and China? So if public policy, why should public policy be concerned with private motor vehicles? That's the question.
So in the project, we did look at the electrification of the transport sector. So when we looked at the results, basically showed that you have very quick gains with regard to cars and light-duty vehicles. But when you get into heavy freight transport and rail transport, we ran into a couple of challenges. First of all, as John mentioned in his presentation, you run into feedstock supply limitations on the ability to produce biofuels. So that is a challenge that we need to have better information on. So that was done in a very preliminary way, and it came out late in the study, and we recognized then that this is an area that needs a lot more investigation. With regard to hydrogen, it was expensive. It was a technologic option, certainly, but we felt that there was testing the limits of credibility. And then on battery storage, I think if we were to do the analysis today, we'd probably give battery storage a more favorable position because of all the technological developments that have occurred in the last 2 or 3 years on that. But it is an area, and the last point really is with regard to rail transport, freight transport by rail. There's no question that that's a technological opportunity. One of the difficulties in Canada is you've got huge distances and light traffic, and so the cost just exploded on us. I think if we were to look at between Montreal and Toronto or between Calgary and Edmonton, for example, the opportunities could be greater, but it's an area that we need to look at in more detail.
John?
So I don't know whether you'd like to add.
Yeah, John will add.
Yeah, I agree with Oskar on the point with respect to the heavy freight for rail, that the distances are long and the traffic is light. But when you look at passenger rail and areas of high density, the study showed that there was considerable possibilities for electrifying passenger transportation within the corridors where the population density is high. So, the London-Quebec City corridor, and as Oskar mentioned, the Edmonton-Calgary corridor. So there is possibility for a limited amount of electrification of rail, but on the long haul, heavy rail transportation, as Oskar mentioned, the cost of putting in the infrastructure to actually do that becomes somewhat prohibitive.
No question?
Bonjour, my name is Philip Raffles. I'm with the Helios Center. in Montreal. I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of your talk, so if you've already answered this question, my apologies. Can you give us an order of magnitude of the quantities of new hydro and nuclear capacity that you're foreseeing over the next 20 or 30 years? And have you thought about siting and costs of these resources?
The answer is yes, and I think I'll ask Oskar to provide the details there, because Oscar's got the best handle on how much, where, and when.
So the total amount of installed hydro capacity in Canada today is 76 gigawatts, and the overall total potential is 263 gigawatts. I think those numbers are roughly right. When we did the analysis, and we did look at all the potential in all the jurisdictions, but we also took into account, the load in the jurisdiction and interconnection between jurisdictions, we got up to about 220 gigawatts total. There was about 40 gigawatts that did not come into the solution process, and that was mainly because of isolation. Some of it was because of high cost. But for example, there's potential in both Yukon and Nunavut, which does not get realized within the planning period. And for the electricity in Alberta, there's quite a lot of potential there, but it's very expensive, and also in Nova Scotia, so it didn't come into the solution process. But in Quebec and Manitoba and British Columbia, when we allowed it to come in, it came in very strong, and the same in Newfoundland and Labrador.
So you're looking at close to 150 gigawatts of new hydro.
Yes. You're basically looking at tripling the amount of electricity, and the lion's share of that is with hydro.
And when you say potential, that's not the techno-economic potential, that's just the technical potential.
Yes.
And
Yes.
do you have a sense of what the cost of this hydropower is going to be?
Does anyone want to comment on cost? John?
I think it's 10 times James Bay.
Is that on average, or the more expensive one?
Well, those are ballpark figures, Class F estimates.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
I think
yeah.
If I could just make another comment with regard to hydro, the inventory of hydro in Canada has been really based on capacity factors, if you're familiar, capacity factors which are roughly equal to system load factor, around 60 or 70%. So that's the inventory. However, when we look at the evolution of systems that have a lot of hydroelectric in it, once you get to full development of the hydro, then what tends to happen is that you add more capacity at the existing sites, and so you can actually get to a lot more than 263 gigawatts. But that's not the way it's defined in the inventory at the present time. But it is a potential that needs to be looked at much more carefully than it has been in the past.
But you don't get more energy from doing that, you just get
No,
more
that's
capacity.
right. The argument there is that when you reach the full potential of your hydro resources, then the natural evolution is to bring in the intermittent renewables and add capacity at your existing hydro sites. And that's a very attractive way to continue developing.
Maybe we'll move on to another question.
Okay, I just wondered about nuclear, if there's a similar...
Let's do another question on the other side, if you don't mind. Yes.
Hi, my name is Pascal Geneviève. I'd like first to thank you for the presentation and the model. What I take from it is that we have a long way to go to get to the 80% decrease, even with the best technology. So I understand that it's a society project, and all part of the economy has to move to transition to something different. So here we are mostly among academics, I guess, maybe a few professionals. And my question is really, how do we reach all the decision makers? How, what would be the drivers for them to switch to think about new ways of doing things? The industry has a key role to play, the transport, and all the players in the economy. So my question is actually also it's a take from all of us. How do we spread the word, especially to the decision makers, to the people in industries, in big companies, and any organization who have to make choices every day and should integrate this new constraint into their decision-making process?
Well, that is the question. That's the most important one of the evening. Well, I think you've seen through the presentation just how much of a challenge this is. And there's a temptation, in fact, I've already heard it a couple of times, for people to say, actually, it's not possible, so why should we go to all the effort? And I like to sort of change that around and say, well, but that's actually not what the study says. The study says that if you look at all of the opportunities that are available and even contemplate that there will be some that come up later on that we don't even know about, that it's possible to do it. So in the short term, which is where we have to start the behavioral change, the thinking change, this report, we're already taking it into key policymaker shops. It's been presented to the federal government, in particular with the new staff in the various ministries that are looking at this. Some provinces have already received it. And I think what it's doing is it's provoking a discussion at the staff level about, okay, how can we set in place the appropriate regulations, policies, and enablers, investment and infrastructure opportunities to begin to get to this. So I am seeing a willingness in our conversations with government. The other part, though, and it came up, there was a technical briefing on this report just 2 hours before this one, and there was one question, I don't know if the fellow was here, but he was talking about how difficult it is to even get an ordinary citizen to think about a price increase on anything. In Vancouver, we had a transit referendum for a solution that would have fallen completely into this report around massive urban transit solution in Vancouver, and it was voted down even though the cost to the average person was 35 cents a day. So we have, I think, a much bigger challenge on the public side of things, and that's where the civil society organizations, and DSF is one of those, has to actually change its focus away from kind of traditional ways that we might have operated and say, all right, we actually have to create optimism and hope and get people on board with this. So this will be if you think of this as the technical challenges wide, then the societal approach to it has to be equally wide. I know that's not an answer that is specific enough, but there is no other way to get at this.
Anybody else wants to comment? Lorne?
Je pense qu'une partie de la réponse à votre question, c'est au niveau de la réglementation. Il est clair, par exemple, que la réglementation sur les émissions d'automobiles, etc., a entraîné des efforts importants pour améliorer à ce niveau-là. Et effectivement, lorsqu'on regarde les projections, il y a un impact considérable. Au niveau des automobiles électriques, etc., c'est une question aussi de prix, de coût. Mais j'arrive de discussions avec des autorités chinoises qui sont préoccupées de la même chose. Et j'ai un exemple à vous montrer pratiquement. Alors, si on regarde sur derrière là-bas, et Miguel, tu vas le lever. Alors, ce moteur est ce que l'on retrouve dans nos appareils domestiques à la maison, un frigidaire, etc. OK? Et c'est ce qu'on veut faire comme réglementation en Chine. Ce moteur a exactement la même puissance, fait exactement le même job que le gros de Miguel. 35% moins d'électricité au même coût. La différence, c'est qu'il y en a un qui prend du cuivre, puis l'autre prend des métaux des aimants de terre. Au même coût, 35% moins d'électricité. Donc, la réglementation, là-bas, fait en sorte que de plus en plus, ils s'en vont dans cette direction-là, avec des effets importants. Faites juste penser, prenez 3 frigidaires au Canada, puis vous enlevez 35% d'énergie, ça a un impact. Donc, une partie de l'impact ne sera pas dans des trucs sociaux, etc., mais que fondamentalement, avec une certaine réglementation qui pousse dans cette direction, qu'il y a des solutions techniques disponibles aujourd'hui qui ont des conséquences importantes, ou en tout cas qui nous entraînent vers l'objectif qui est visé. Alors, ce n'est pas la solution à tout, mais ça fait partie, dans le fond, du mix qui amène vers la solution que l'on a besoin.
Si je peux
Nos
ajouter
commentaires, oui.
aussi que, en fait, les coûts qu'on a vus, les courbes de coûts qu'on a vues, c'est vraiment le coût marginal de réduction de la dernière tonne de CO2. Donc, les coûts apparaissent élevés, mais en fait, si on construisait une courbe de coûts pour différents niveaux de prix de carbone, on verrait qu'il y a beaucoup de réductions qui peuvent être atteintes à des coûts très raisonnables, en fait, avant d'arriver à des coûts de 500 $ la tonne. Il y a beaucoup de choses qui peuvent être faites sous 100 $ la tonne. Donc, c'est d'y aller aussi comme ils font au Royaume-Uni. Eux autres, ils travaillent par ce qu'on appelle des carbon budgets. Donc, ils vont par période de 5 ans, regardent quelles mesures tu peux mettre en place à moindre coût et ils vont par bloc comme ça. Donc, pour identifier les politiques à mettre en place, ça serait la meilleure façon de procéder.
Merci. C'est bon? On va peut-être prendre une autre question de ce côté-là avant de revenir ici. Oui.
Bonjour. En fait, je suis un peu... I'm amazed about the timing of your announcement today. I'm not sure you're aware, but the Bureau des audiences publiques sur l'environnement are currently in the process of studying in public, how do you say that, audience publique on the Energy East project. We're talking about 1 million barrels a day of new petrol, pretty much petroleum and dilbits and all this stuff coming to east of Canada. This is a net addition to the already existing production. I'm just, is that project have an impact? The go, no-go of this project has an impact on all your models? Because we're talking like a lot of new added capacity. And it's one of the challenges you were mentioning is fossil fuel production. And we all know the process of making this kind of fuel is like very carbon intensive compared to conventional oil. So just wondering how you stand on this point.
So the question is, what is the impact of the Energy East project could have on the results?
Exactly.
Okay. Does anyone want to take the Kathleen?
I mean, in fact, this project in the model is an option, though, so it's optimized within the solution. And in some of the scenario, we had the assumptions that the fossil fuel production will follow NEB projections in a fixed manner. So then the project, of course, I mean, is there because it's much. The oil price in Alberta is cheaper than the oil buy on international market, but in some scenario where fossil fuel production was left flexible, the model will just lower the production, and this project will not happen. And we saw it in the cost curve. There's a series of scenarios that would call with the A beside are cheaper, and this is partially due to the fact that fossil fuel production is reduced, and this project is not necessarily happening. Or if it's happening, it's not in the size that is actually, planned. But yeah.
Any other comment? No? Okay.
Well, I'll just add that it's really important to remember the numbers that John showed. When you get out to scenario 8, which is the kitchen sink, and it's just like everything, we throw everything at this challenge. And remember that we looked at, we used numbers that came from already identifiable sources. So fossil fuel production was based on numbers that came from the National Energy Board. But then the project board decided that, we can't assume that Canada is operating in a vacuum from the rest of the world. If the world is committed to taking on reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, we just have to assume that the rest of the demand for fossil fuels in the rest of the world will begin to come down at the same rate that we're projecting in Canada to achieve those targets. So scenario 8A has a significant reduction in exports based on world demand, and as a result, you reduce not only do you start to see the production emissions come down significantly. So when you do that, as Kathleen says, then you start to see, then you start to throw into question a lot of the fossil fuel infrastructure that's actually being planned for the country. There's no escaping that when you reduce the production capacity.
Okay, so we'll come back to this.
Okay, well, I
side for
have
another
two
question.
things. One I intended to ask, which I'm going to keep for a second. The second one is that I'm a bit wary of miracle solutions. Now, that's it that we've just been shown with a motor. I object to, for very simple reason that electric motors, as they are now, are easily 90% efficient. And basically, if you've got already getting 90% of your electricity into the mechanical power that you want out of your motor, you can't get 35% more. That can't be done. Motor cannot be 125% efficient. If you start with 80, you're not going to save 35. Now, that I didn't expect this kind of thing, so I didn't expect to ask this question. The question I really have is, basically, we agree that we'll need, if we electrify everything, we'll need more electricity.
Yes.
And my question is, how many thousand square kilometers of forest are we going to have to flood with, of course, the result of all the methane that's coming out of the rotting wood and the loss of biosynthesis, photosynthesis that is going to come from all those flooded forests. At the moment, we have something like 20,000 square kilometers in Quebec that are flooded for I mean, I would have objected to that at the time, but I didn't because I wasn't smart enough to see what was coming. So I didn't, but I would object to tripling that amount of
So the question is the environmental impact of such a big development of hydro. Does anyone want to?
No, I was going to suggest we ask Warren to respond to that.
That's true. Warren, please come up. We have an expert in our midst on this matter, so Warren, please.
Sure. So the question is about expanding hydro reserves and wiping out forests and the trade-off there. And the answer is we didn't look at massive increases in reservoir scale. I mean, there would be some increase and that would offset some forest productivity. We were very, shall I say, careful about those kind of projections. One of the most important things as we move forward is that the forests that we're going to use are being managed well. You know, that's the other piece of the puzzle that a lot of people seem to forget is that if we're not managing the forest well, if we're not utilizing them well, there's going to be more insect infestations, there's going to be more fire, there's going to be more carbon release. And so a big part of this project looked at bioenergy and the role therein with the assumption that we want to see a healthy, well-managed kind of forest landscape. So if we were to expand hydro reservoirs and the hydro reserves, one of the pieces that you have to work into that is that the land would be prepared appropriately, that we wouldn't just be flooding an existing forest like they did when they built the Rideau Canal. I mean, this is the 21st century now. So we're going to prepare the land properly, try to minimize those types of emissions and capture those emissions where we can, and grab the energy that we can get back. And certainly one of the things that I'm very interested in is the trade-off between getting your energy from a living forest ecosystem that can be managed and renewed, and getting your energy from a hydro reservoir. And there's a balance there, and that's why I was so happy to work with some of the members of this team, well, all the members, not just some of them, who have the engineering expertise to be able to do some of those trade-offs. That's a rambling response. Sorry, I jumped into it kind of quickly, but hopefully I got there in the end. Good?
It is a good question, though, and the only thing the trade-off on large versus small versus medium-sized reservoirs, of course, it's a big question. It's a big question about big dams in the future of the country. But what has changed is the realization that you can't just flood a landscape without removing the organics, first of all. And we're seeing right now big debates about not just removing the timber, but actually removing the soil as well, because otherwise you end up with, we're now finding, other problems with respect to mercury and other contaminants in the water. So I think that for future reservoirs of whatever scale, at least you'll be seeing a different treatment of the reservoir space.
I'd just like to
One more.
add one more comment about that. One of the things that we did not have the time to look at in the study, which I believe has a great deal of promise, is something that we call incremental hydro, which is where you take the existing reservoirs that already exist and you add a lot more generation capacity to those existing reservoirs. And then the extra energy available from that, you combine that with things like large-scale development of wind. And these reservoirs then essentially become like giant batteries and energy storage systems. And you can greatly increase the total amount of reliable electricity when you do that. And the way you would use these dams then would be quite different than they are today. Like here in Quebec, most of the dams we have are used to meet basic demand. In the peak of winter, for example, everything that Hydro-Quebec has is used to meet the demand of energy here in Quebec. But if you were to double or triple the turbines on those dams and you were to couple that with a lot of wind farms in Quebec, Ontario, the northeastern United States, you could greatly increase the total amount of electrical supply from renewables, but you would only be using these dams, these turbines, you would turn them on only on days when there's no wind and you need the electricity. So the use cycle of those reservoirs would be different, but you would not be adding more reservoirs, you were just making a lot better use of the ones we already have.
Thank you. So now you know that if you're here, you can be called upon to answer a question. On compte sur vous. There's quite a few people lined up for questions. I'd like us to get to all the questions, so I'll ask you to keep your questions brief so that we can cover all the topics. Maybe I'll go to one question on this side.
Oui, bonjour. Il a été mentionné tout à l'heure rapidement qu'il fallait entre autres s'appuyer sur le nucléaire. Ma question est assez simple. Est-ce qu'il y a un programme de développement du nucléaire au Canada ou est-ce qu'à contrario, ça va plutôt être un programme de... On continue à utiliser le nucléaire, mais petit à petit, le programme va être arrêté, un peu comme ce qui s'est passé en Allemagne.
So the question is there a program in Canada to build more nuclear? Or how is the issue of more nuclear or nuclear development, how can it be addressed? What is in place? Oskar?
So there's a couple of answers to that. First of all, in the solutions, in some of the scenarios, most of the scenarios, nuclear did come in as an option. We did look at one scenario in which we said there is no more nuclear and compared that to a comparable scenario with nuclear. And what came out of that was that the difference in cost for the option with no nuclear and the option with nuclear, the difference in cost was relatively small. We were surprised, okay? But the composition of the overall electricity supply mix changed dramatically, okay? It was really incredible. But I would have to say that this is an area that requires a lot more assessment. I mean, we were dealing with pretty rough numbers, particularly with regard to the pump storage costs and so on, and we were making assumptions that whatever pump storage was required, it would be available, that we would have the upstream and downstream reservoirs to supply that and so on. So that's kind of one answer. The second answer is that we need to be very careful about saying, well, nuclear doesn't sort of show that big an advantage in the short term. But we have to remember that the ultimate resource capability of hydro will have a limit, okay? And there will come a time then when you really do need dependable capacity, and it needs to be a non-emitting dependable capacity source. And at that stage, nuclear becomes a very attractive option. So you have to really keep nuclear in the mix, no matter what the results look like in the short term.
Now, one of the beauties of this study is that we don't all agree on all of the options. But we all agreed that we would put them on the table just to be able to see where this started and how we could get to the solution. That was the most important takeaway for me, was that we all agreed on where you would start. When you get to the back end of the 2050 time period, that's when nuclear starts to show up, for the very reasons that Oskar has indicated. We start running out of other possibilities. But when I look at this, I also take away the assumption that there's more certainty at the front end than there is at the back end. So I'm still looking at this as that I don't believe in, I think it was your point, that there's no magic solutions in technology out there, but we are seeing advances every day. So I look at this as, all right, let's get started right now, and I don't actually know what's going to happen at the back end when we get to those final pieces, those very expensive hydrogen options and nuclear. We may find that we're faced with other choices at that point. But for the purposes of looking at this, this is a really good start for us to look at how we could do it.
Thank you. Une autre question de ce côté-ci?
Oui, bonjour. J'ai cru comprendre dans votre étude que vous cherchiez les solutions à moindre coût pour atteindre des cibles de réduction de CO2, mais est-ce qu'il y avait un moyen dans votre étude de prendre en compte les coûts estimés de rien faire puis de laisser les changements climatiques se produire d'eux-mêmes?
Okay. So the question is, was somewhere in the model built the option of, with a cost of not doing anything and having the consequences of climate change? I think that's the question. Yep.
Yeah, no, the answer is simple as no, we didn't look at the cost of adaptation to climate change. No. We need different models for that, and for the time frame of the project, we could not do it.
So the costs were purely economic costs?
Mitigation costs.
Mitigation costs, essentially. Ce côté-là?
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. You showed a lot about the production or the transformation of energy and how to make energy available for the different uses. As far as I'm concerned, I think that to make informed decisions, especially by citizens, they need to be much more informed indeed. And you know, we spoke about the fact that energy efficiency would be something extremely important. I think that there has been already a lot of energy efficiency achievements in various industries. What was sometimes the result is more consumption of more things, which created ultimately the same demand on energy. So I think that more than trying indeed to ensure that the availability of energy meets the current, let's say, demand or way of living, I would strongly recommend that it's more indeed an understanding of the energy issue and greenhouse gas issue by the public to make informed decisions, and the leaders as well. Thank you.
John?
Yeah, in addition to the efficiency, we talked about conservation. And, you know, efficiency comes about by somebody else making something that much more efficient to use. Conservation comes about largely by individual decisions to use less energy, to use energy differently, and to change their lifestyles. So your point is right on, that when we're talking about the leveling off of energy consumption as time goes out, when we apply the greenhouse gas constraints, there are two factors there, efficiency and conservation. And conservation comes very, very much back to practices both within one's personal domain and how industries actually go about dealing with their energy needs.
I'd just like to add something to that. The study, the way it was done, energy efficiency was one of the factors that was modeled into it, and it's one of the reasons why, even though economic growth and population growth is projected to be quite large, total energy consumption remains about flat, if I'm not correct.
That's right.
If I'm not mistaken. But in order to really fully capitalize on that, this is one of the areas that I believe is the low-hanging fruit that we should be pushing big time to get adopted on a much larger scale. And where's Bruce Bruce Ivy. So a colleague of mine from the Ivy Foundation, Bruce Lortie, and he's organizing a group of ecologically minded Canadian foundations to fund projects in this area. And one of the first goals we have is to try and convince governments across Canada that introducing strong, rules and legislation to encourage, massive increases in efficiency of homes and buildings and so on is a very good place to get started on this problem. Right. So we're planning to make that sort of a next phase of our efforts. Thank you.
Move on to the next question on my left.
My name is Laurel Thompson, and I would really like to see Canada have a revenue-neutral carbon price. And I was disappointed the other day when Catherine McKenna said that it was not possible to think about doing that right now because it would create national disunity. And so my question to you is can you think of any way in which we could get Western oil interests on board with a price on carbon by offering them a way to make electricity from petrol? Maybe I'm talking about carbon capture and storage with petrol, but is that a possibility that they could have their petrol, but we could make electricity from it cleanly?
Thank you. Absolutely. Yes.
Do you want to answer that, Kathleen?
Peter?
Yeah.
Well, I won't tackle the technical issue, Kathleen will, but I want to maybe challenge you a bit on the revenue-neutral carbon tax. So there's be a report coming out in the next couple of days from the Ecofiscal Commission that looks at recycling revenues from a carbon tax. And in particular, they looked at British Columbia, where there has been a price on carbon since 2008. It's now at $30 a ton, and that was based on revenue neutral. It was all recycled back through reductions. And they've concluded that at that point, to go deeper, and you have to go deeper if you want to achieve the province's own legislated targets, that the next round shouldn't be a revenue neutral, because they looked at the tax rates in BC and they found, well, it's actually no point in going any lower. And instead, at this point in time, you start doing investments. You start investing in other aspects that would help achieve the goals you're looking after. So investments in transit and transportation infrastructure and other maybe vulnerable families. But you don't after a certain point, it doesn't actually pay to reduce the taxes any further. They're some of the lowest in the Western world.
Yes, can I answer that?
Yeah, sure.
My understanding is that what they did in British Columbia was that they lowered taxes for businesses and so on. They didn't, and they also spent their money on many projects which were just favorite projects of the government, and it's that I think we should get away from, the government choosing what it's going to do with the revenue. I think my goal would be to have a tax where you would give the money back to Canadian families and let them spend the money.
So we shouldn't get into a debate, but I can tell you it's legislated that all the money was on personal income tax reductions. It's right in the legislation.
I think we'll have John first and then Oskar respond to that. And then
whether you tax, whether you do cap and trade, whether you have incentives for investment, the money's got to come from somewhere to pay for the infrastructure that's required to provide for the clean energy sources. So a revenue neutral tax provides disincentives to using carbon intensive sources of electricity, let's say, but that only gets you so far. There need to be ways of going beyond that. Tax is one way. Another way which we really need to think about is changing priorities in government. If this is so important, why are we not changing the way government spends the money that it already gets through taxation? And we need to think about that as well. So the real question for me is where does the money come from? And then the corollary of that, well, if you get the money, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to spend it in the most effective way to get to a lower greenhouse gas future in the best possible way?
Oskar?
I just wanted to add on that we've, with the World Energy Council, we've had a lot of discussions about taxation and what are the mechanisms and how do they really work and so on. So one of the things that I've always said is that the tax regime that was put in BC is one of the most creative tax regimes anywhere in the world in terms of getting the whole process started. And the fact that it was put in, it was publicly accepted, and it works and it's fair, generally fair, is very important. However, if you really want to achieve the major reductions that we're talking about in this study, you can't do it on a tax-neutral basis. It's going to cost, and I think this is what the Ecofiscal Commission is really addressing in a very good way, because you have to find a way of getting the money that's collected being used in the most effective way to achieve the large reductions in GHG emissions that you're really targeting for. In our study, we actually interacted with the people in the UK who are responding to the legislation that was passed in the UK in 2008, which says that basically it's a law that they have to achieve 80% reduction in GHG emissions by 2050 relative to 1990, exactly the same terms of reference as we have here. And so when we started to talk about taxation, and they said you should not think about tax neutral because it doesn't work. Secondly, you should not talk about referencing it to a do-nothing scenario, because once you get started, the do-nothing doesn't mean anything anymore, okay? So you're always incrementing, and you're trying to find a way of incrementing forward in the most cost-effective manner. So I think, you know, the leadership that's being provided by the Ecofiscal Commission is really, really excellent in terms of addressing that, but you cannot do it with tax neutrality.
We could spend a long time
don't
on
wanna
this
argue
one.
about
I
that.
want to give other people a chance.
I don't want to argue about that, and I'm
So-
sorry that you didn't answer my question about petrol.
Which maybe you can ask it afterwards.
Okay. all right,
I
I'll
want to
ask you
give
after.
a chance to other
That's fair.
people
Okay.
for the questions. Thank you. We.
Good evening. My name is John Packin from Carbon Consult Group. I really want to thank you for this wonderful board and great opportunity to talk tonight about something Mr. Trottier and Mr. Sigvaldason, well, I'm sorry, I have a problem with your last name. I'm very sorry about that. Both discussed and mentioned about the nuclear in your scenarios, and also pump storage / large hydro, and perhaps revamp some of the large hydros to accommodate pump storage, and of course to balance loads on new renewables. I think that's great. But when I look at the scenarios you use, and it's not negative what I'm about to say, I'm just wondering, I just want to ask you, I see a lot of use on nuclear, and for instance, in BC, I don't know if that includes Site C, the big the power dam there that's going to be the 1.1 gigawatt dam that's going to be built. So I was wondering, how come these scenarios were not focused on hydro and more on nuclear? I guess that's my question.
So I'll try to answer the question because I'm not sure that I understand it clearly. But in British Columbia, we assumed that Site C was a committed project. Okay, so that was not an option. So we were looking at beyond Site C. Okay, now as you know, at the present time, there's existing legislation in British Columbia that says no more large-scale hydro after Site C, and so the bulk of our scenarios were based on that premise. But we did have discussions with BC Hydro because we were really anxious to sort of look at this just in terms of the resource potential. And for our last set of rounds, BC Hydro agreed that we should look at the scenario, even though it's against the existing legislation. And so what really came out of that is that once we put that in, all that hydro came in with a bang. Just just over 30 gigawatts of hydro. It's a huge amount. It's triple what's already there. So, you know, and as John said, some of the results, are not practically realizable because of the sheer magnitude of what needs to be built and how fast it needs to be built, okay? If you really are focusing on minimum cost.
Thank you. Appreciate that very much. Thanks.
Thank you. Another question from this side?
The question I've been standing in line to ask is simply order of magnitude of how much new nuclear you're talking about. But if I may, I'd like to respond to some of the things that have been said about hydro in the meantime, quickly.
Because I want to give other people a chance. So let's answer the nuclear question.
Okay.
What order of magnitude of nuclear are we talking about?
It depended on the scenario. With the high fossil fuel production scenario and with the need to basically electrify the dominant, one of the major uses of electricity was to convert the use of natural gas for steam production for extracting oil from the oil sands. So that was huge. And so we converted all the use of natural gas to electric boilers, and then we wound up with an incredibly large load. And so in that case, we were looking at up to 100 gigawatts of nuclear. Now, when we went to the low fossil fuel production scenarios, the amount of nuclear in Alberta was way, way down. So it was very much dependent on the scenario. And in our report, we're very careful to say that when we look at the options for extracting oil from the oil sands, we only looked at two technologies. One was just to stay with the way it is right now, where you're burning natural gas to produce high-pressure steam for SAGD production, or you convert all of that to using electric boilers, which again is a huge electricity load. But we know that there's a lot of work going on in the oil sector in terms of looking at other process options for extracting oil without using electricity, or at least using a lot less electricity. And the main one is really associated with using solvents with low-pressure steam. So that was not studied.
For the sake of fairness, I'll just ping-pong to the other side for another
Just
question.
An additional comment quickly, but
Sorry.
these high nuclear number were coming in what we call high fossil fuel production is not only oil, but also natural gas and coal. That was where the level was maintained at what the NEB is projecting. So it's a lot. If you want to electrify the extraction and the production of all these fuel, you need that much nuclear. But it was the only case where the number was that high.
Guy?
Bonjour, je ne poserai pas de questions sur le nucléaire. Je vais poser une question sur l'hydrogène. On semble parler dans...
The joke is that Professor Marleau is in nuclear engineering. So he said he's not asking a question about nuclear.
Je vais poser une question sur l'hydrogène. Vous semblez affirmer que l'hydrogène, c'est une source d'énergie. Or, je pense que ce n'est pas une source d'énergie, c'est un vecteur d'énergie. Donc, lorsque vous parlez d'hydrogène, de quelle énergie parlez-vous? Comment l'avez-vous produit?
So the question is, hydrogen is not a form of energy, it's a vector. It's an energy vector. So when we say hydrogen, what exactly do we mean as a technology? I think, is that a fair, Guy? Is that a fair rendering of the question? Yep.
Actually,
Kathleen?
I think we on the board here we all agree with that statement actually, and the hydrogen was produced from water electrolysis, and the hydrogen was coming in the solution as a very last option when there was nothing else possible, and it was only in there were 70 end-use demand segments in only one of them, and it's heavy freight transportation. At some point, we didn't model the battery for the largest heavy truck segment, and at some point we were running out of feedstock to have second generation biofuel, and only after that the hydrogen was coming. So in all of the scenario where we were looking at demand reduction or giving more flexibility in other sector, the hydrogen option was not part of the solution.
But I think
Yes.
Yes.
No, not by natural gas, no. No, water electrolysis.
It was based on electricity. I think that's the answer.
Yeah, because, I mean,
on the electrolysis.
There's 10 or 15 different technology in the model to produce hydrogen, but I mean, the model was just using the cheapest one.
Okay.
My question is about economic growth, and I apologize if I missed the part of your talk where you explained the assumptions you made about that. But there's been a disconnect between quality of life and economic growth in the advanced countries since the end of the 70s, roughly, if you look at genuine progress indicator and other things like this. I think that it's not going to be very possible to decarbonize to the extent that you're looking at if we don't go towards a steady state economy. And I guess I'd like your opinion on that.
So I just wanted to explain what we did with regard to economic and socioeconomic projections. So we actually began with simulating population growth by simulating, using the CanSim data and so on. So we, normal projection with regard to migration and in-migration, out-migration, and so on. So at the end of that process, we projected that the population of Canada would increase from 34 million in 2011 to 48 million in 2050, okay? We then did a projection on GDP per capita, and we used the trends that were in the NEB report, which they had taken out to 2035, and then we projected that beyond 2035, basically on the basis of saturation of growth. So we just said that even though you have growth, the rate of growth is going to decline. So we did that. And so the GDP per capita in 2011 dollars went from about 45,000 to about 65,000 in 2050. And then so the GDP total went from just under 1.5 trillion in 2011 to just over 3 trillion in 2050. So basically doubling the size of the economy. We then went from there and we looked at each of the gross output from each of the industrial sectors. And so by and large, the industrial gross output doubled over that period. And so one might have said, so why didn't the demand for energy double? Okay, because that would have been the natural reaction. The reason it didn't double, because all the end users were being satisfied, including the growth in industrial gross output. But the big changes were really that all of the opportunities for energy conservation, energy efficiency were being realized because the economics were there for that to happen. And secondly, that there was a huge reduction in energy demand in the transportation sector because of the conversion to basically to electrified transport for cars and light-duty vehicles. So as John showed, even with the doubling of the size of the economy, the increase, with no GHG emission constraints was about 30%. And then when we put in the GHG emission constraints, there was no growth. So it stayed flat, even with the doubling of the economy. So I hope that sort of explains what we did.
Shouldn't we
Because
be
we did a
aiming
lot of
for
work
a
on
steady
that.
state economy then? And then
Sorry?
we could actually, if we were aiming at a steady state economy, then we might be
Should
able
we
to
move
make
to an economy where there is no growth?
Yeah, we did not look at that.
Okay,
No.
yeah.
Hello. Thank you for being here and for all the information. My question is regarding education and general education, not the education for the people that are here. And we are here, I imagine, because we're interested in the subject for different reasons. But my question is, how do you think education can be used as a tool to inform people, to inform common citizens about greener choices, to improve or to go towards a greener economy, and how the government how the government should regulate that. I mean, that's a question also, if the government should regulate that.
So just to clarify, by education, you mean the formal education system, the
No,
school
I mean
system?
the education of the consumer, not
Okay,
not
so
academic
information
education,
of- okay.
awareness, to create awareness and
Awareness and okay, and
yes,
information of the
critical
public.
thinking about environment.
Okay.
Well, I'll take a first stab at this, because this is an area I know something about. People don't change their behaviors because they get new information. They change their behaviors because they see others taking action and doing things. So really what we're looking at here is essentially creating the change so that people are doing it, others see it, and it creates some momentum. And the classic example is what we've done with recycling. So, you know, it's got to the point now that if you're in a neighborhood that has a recycling program and you're not recycling, you'll be shunned. So I think we have to assume that, make that a much larger picture. As we start to understand, yes, you do have to understand what's going on, but as communities and individuals start taking action, because there will always be people at the front end that do the changes, they're already doing it now. What will happen is you'll hit a point where that becomes the norm, and then that's where we make substantive process. But we have to be very careful that we say just throwing information at this is going to solve the problem. It won't.
Excuse me, do you think the government should play a role in that? Like founding, that, for example, here in Quebec, there are already different institutions funded by the government that encourage people to do different things, but it's like a free will for the citizens to do something. It's not something that they don't, I don't think they see a direct or an economic motivation necessarily.
Well, I mean, I would fully support governments investing in education, but I would say that if you follow what I just said a minute ago, you would have much better impact if you funded local community groups that are taking action than you would through education, if you wanted to change this issue.
I think John has a comment.
Yeah, in terms of the role that governments could play, they could provide incentives, as they do now. For example, if one wants to buy an electric car, there are incentives. And they could also provide regulation, so as to provide targets for which industries, have to conform, targets to which individuals have to conform, perhaps, so that on one hand it's the old carrot and stick, so that there are incentives for people to change their behavior and regulations which basically don't accept the kind of societal or behavioral issues which exist now.
Thank you very much.
Le temps. One.
So I just wanted to add a comment there. One of the aspirations that, first of all, this problem is really, really complex because anything that you do in any sector impacts, and so you have this situation that, and the interlinkages between various sectors play. And, so it's a really complex interplay, and it's not intuitively logical what happens in certain situations. And for us on the project, it's been an incredible learning experience, where we've actually begun to understand that if you do certain things here, then something else happens somewhere else. And so our aspiration of the project team was really, if we can develop an analytical capability that makes it very clear what the consequences are, and then we can begin to inform the public about the trade-offs, okay, so that they understand that if you don't build hydro in some jurisdiction, there's another minimum cost solution when you impose that constraint, which is much more expensive, or it may be just a little bit more expensive, but at least then the public is much better informed about what are the consequences of certain types of policies and actions. So that's part of our aspiration here.
Thank you very much.
Le temps passe et puis on ne veut pas aller au-delà de 7h30 avec la fin de l'événement. Donc, on va prendre une, au maximum 2 questions de plus, dépendamment du temps. So we'll have at most 2 more questions.
Raymond Leduc. There's a lot of questions, many questions that could be asked from your presentation. It wouldn't be fair to say that you covered all, and I know it's very difficult to cover a difficult subject like that. There's things like why not solar, Wind, where is it? There's a bunch of stuff in your study. Where's the panic button?
Where is the?
The panic button.
Where is the panic button?
Where's the emergency exit? Where's the urgency? In the 90s, we had discussion like this, and that's why I'm saying it's completely unfair to your committee. It's not directly to your committee, but think about it as a human species, and I'm looking at the youngsters here. You will have to kick people out of office right now when you think about it. They're not taking the right action course, and that's exactly what we're talking. I had the chance this summer with Kathleen to do the course with Alan Gore. And Al Gore, in his last half hour of the entire one day that we had with him, what he's talking about? Inequalities in the world. He's talking about the big problem that we have. Nothing to do with the cost of energy, by the way, completely undervalued. Le bilan environnemental is not put in that cost. Imagine, we're still talking about a pipeline that will cost, what, a few million per kilometers? It should cost 10 million per kilometers. What's the difference? It will cost billions.
So your question is, where's the cost of the environment taken
No.
into account?
Where's the panic button?
Okay.
Where
Let's see
is
what,
it? Where are we going with this? We are still talking, and I'm including myself in this. We are still talking about this.
So does anyone on the panel want to take a crack at this one?
I know it's unfair to you, but if you talk to people like David Suzuki, he talked about that lately. Jacques, before dying, he talked about that. Hubert Reeves talked about that in the Le Mal de Terre in 2000. And he's saying we are doing a bad job right now.
Well, I can tell you that at the David Suzuki Foundation, the panic button is pushed every day. So, but that wasn't the purpose of this study. We have to be very, very clear. We have a responsibility once we've said, look, this is urgent, we need to move on this, we have to do everything we can to address this really formidable problem. But this was to to sort of move oneself back and say, well, how do you do that? And the how you do it is then has to be a bit more pragmatic. You actually have to look at you have to look at the engineering, you have to look at the economics, you have to look at you have to look at politics. That's correct. And we know that when we so this study assumes that none of that exists. I mean, it just assumes that there will be ultimate political will to do everything that we've done here, and we know how difficult that's going to be. But we needed to see what it would look like if we removed those constraints and said, could Canada do it? And uncomfortable as it is for a number of us on the panel, we at least have a sense that what the magnitude is and how you could address the panic button if you started putting actions together. So that's why you almost have to sort of step back and say, there's no panic button in this study. It's how could you do it? The panic button has to be elsewhere to push, as you said, politicians and everybody else to take the action.
Maybe one last comment on that question?
Yeah,
Yes?
and these kind of studies are very useful to start with, to show the magnitude of the problem. And as Oskar was saying, that we have learned a lot ourselves just to looking at how much transition we need to get there. And I worked with government all over the world, and still every day when you ask people for data or for assumptions about this or that, people still have a great deal to imagine a future which is not a business as usual. Maybe for people who are interested to the topic, it's more obvious, and you say that this and this, and who talks about this and that, but many people still haven't heard about it, and I think we are still not talking about it enough, because every day I'm in the discussion with people on government and high level where they just don't understand the difficulties of the challenge and what we need, and it's by doing this kind of analysis that they can just start thinking that way, by seeing how you could get there and what you need to get there.
Lorne?
Yeah, I just want to, I may repeat myself in my closing remarks, but anyway, Appel, we do have the willingness of some governments to do something. So point out that the Government of Canada has an official target of reducing greenhouse gases by 30% versus 2005 by 2030. In Quebec, the government is planning to have a target of 37.5% reduction by 2030 relative to 1992. So they are thinking about targets, but unfortunately one of the things they haven't quite figured out exactly how they're going to meet those targets.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is where the use of models such as the one we use in this project, I think, can be very useful to show, what is possible and what are the lowest cost ways of achieving those targets. So I'll have a little bit more to say on the closing remarks.
Thank you. As Lorne said, we do need to move on to closing remarks because I would like to stop at 7:30 or as close to it as possible. So I apologize to those who haven't got to the microphone, but time is of the essence and we have to stop. So before formally ending the event, I'm going to invite the representatives of each of the partners of the Futures Project to provide a short closing statement, starting with Peter Robinson for the Suzuki Foundation, and I'll ask them to keep it to 1 minute. So
1 minute. Oops, that was 10 seconds right there.
That
was another 5. Suffice it to say, I already said that this was a very uncomfortable project for the foundation to do. It asked us to look at things that we don't normally look at. And I'm glad that we stuck with it. We learned a lot. And in particular, we learned what we're going to do with this work. So the real value to the foundation was where to get started. So we're going to throw the next 5 years of our efforts on the things that have been indicated that have to go first: transit and transportation, interprovincial exchange of electricity, coal phase, those sorts of things. Well, so that's informed by this report. That's one of the beauties of it. So uncomfortable as we were, we do like the solidness of the modeling, and it's a model. It just tells us indications, and we'll go from there. So I want to acknowledge the rest of the partners who have pushed us and worked with us and stuck with us, and as we did with them all the way through this. I do want to thank 2 people. I do want to thank Lorne, who when I approached him back in 2009, actually, I said we were interested in doing some work, and he said, yes, I'll support you, but you have to partner with the Canadian Academy of Engineering. And I'm not sure whether to thank him or not, but as I said, we learned a lot. And if the title of the project is Canada's Challenge and Opportunity, one of the challenges is that we have to learn to work with groups that we don't always work with. There is no other way to solve the challenges that the country has. So that was one that we learned. And I do want to also acknowledge the really good work of Oskar Sigvaldason. He's the last 2 years, he's been the project manager, and he's doubled down on our efforts to get to the real nitty-gritty of the report. The first few years was just sketching out the architecture of what the project would look like. So Oskar, I want to, on behalf of all of the panel, thank you so much for all the hard work.
Pierre, let's see.
Well, my first words are going to be to thank Lorne Trottier to basically have made a forced marriage between the Suzuki Foundation and the Canadian Academy. I guess quite a few people were wondering why we were associating, and so the mirror image of Peter's problem. But my point to Peter was the following, is that whether we approach those issues differently, I think there's a basic agreement that the issue about greenhouse gas emissions is important and it's got to be resolved somehow. And at the end of the day, CAE and Suzuki coming together publicly or before policymakers, saying we went through a very rigorous exercise and we think this is a better way to look at the issues, to make sure that you understand what the problems are, because if you want to realize it, it's got to be more than speeches. It's got to hit the road, and that if we do that together, the credibility about it is much more is important, and you have better chances to get forward, because at the end of the day, this is a problem of society, and in society you're going to have different people thinking different ways. And if there's not a certain consensus, it's going to be very difficult to move forward. So I think in that sense, working together has taught us to work together, number one, but I think in terms of contribution to the debate and to policy making, I think the fact that we're together there is an important point, and that we owe to Lorne for doing that. I want to echo the words of thanks of Peter for Oskar. He was sometimes, I guess, caught in the crossfire between the ecolos and the engineers. But as you can see today, he survived. So, so Oskar, thank you very much. But I also like to thank my colleague, John Leggat, who was chair of that project. I'm not sure he knew what he was signing on when he agreed. But he's put a lot of energy, and to a large extent, a lot of the results and the rigor that was underlying that project stems from his contribution, and I would say steadfast direction of the project. So John, thank you very much.
Merci. And now the last word to the matchmaker,
Okay.
Lorne Trottier for the Trottier Family Foundation.
Right. Well, thank you guys for those generous remarks. So I'd just like to say a few words about how I developed my interest in this area of energy and climate change and why we're here today. Basically, I developed a keen interest in both electronics and science when I was a pretty young fellow, about 11 years old. And the interest in electronics gave rise to my company, Matrox, and my business success. But my interest in science has been very deep from a very young age. But it's really my youngest daughter, Sylvie, who got me interested in the issue of climate change when she studied it in university about a dozen odd years ago. And so when Peter, as he mentioned, first approached me about doing a project where we would look at 80% reductions in greenhouse gases for Canada, I went and consulted with some academic friends. Geza Yus here from McGill University was the one who gave me the idea of making a joint effort with the Canadian Academy of Engineering. And this was really motivated by my deep scientific values, that I feel that any project that would do this should be based on rigorous engineering and scientific analysis and so on. And so it seemed to me that a partnership between these two organizations would be a good way of making sure that that would happen. So I managed to convince Peter here that this eccentric marriage was something that would be worthwhile to do. So I thank him for that. Let's see. With this project, I don't believe that our project is the final word on the energy solutions for Canada, how to reduce greenhouse gases. But it is, I think, the first of its kind that's tried to look at this problem on a national scale, on a holistic scale. And so I think there's value in that. I also believe that the study teaches us some very valuable lessons about at least some of the initial steps that are necessary to achieve this significant goal. And to me, that's one of the what I hope is going to be a lasting value of this is that both hopefully the public and policymakers will understand that if you want to achieve major reductions in greenhouse gases, as I mentioned earlier, Canada has a 30% reduction target, Quebec has a 37.5% reduction target. Those are great to have those targets. but how do we get there? You know, and I believe that these models are powerful tools for figuring out how you're actually going to get there. If you don't use some kind of an analytical methodology for figuring out how you're going to achieve your goals, it's a bit like flying an airplane without instruments and without a navigation system. If you want to get to where you want to go, you better have those instruments. So if we want to achieve even these incremental goals of 37.5% reduction, using models like this, I think, is a valuable tool for how to get there. Finally, you know, again, I'd like to thank Peter for proposing the project and for accepting this crazy idea of this partnership. I'd like to thank John Leggat, who was president of the CAE at the time that I proposed that collaboration, and he's been a pillar of the project from the very beginning, a support, and he's been an active participant in it throughout. I thank him for that. I'd also like to thank his successors, les successeurs comme président de ACG, comme Pierre Lortie, qui est ici ce soir, et Richard Marceau, qui n'est pas ici ce soir, mais qui a joué un rôle important, ainsi que Kevin Goheen, qui est l'executive director du ACG, pour leur soutien. Et je veux remercier les spécialistes qui ont travaillé sur le projet, spécialement Kathleen Vaillancourt, qui est ici à la table, et Michael Hoffman, qui n'est pas ici ce soir, mais ce sont les deux spécialistes des modèles de système de l'énergie qu'on a utilisés pour le projet. Et j'aimerais remercier Miguel Anjos, le directeur de l'Institut d'énergie Trottier, pour sa participation dans le projet et pour être notre hôte ce soir. And finally, I'd like to thank Oskar Sigvaldason for his tireless efforts to coordinate and bring together a diverse group of collaborators to carry out this unique, but I hope valuable project. Thank you. Merci.
Sur ce, merci beaucoup encore à tous d'être venus ce soir. J'espère que la soirée vous a plu. À la prochaine. Au revoir.